Hello, today I'm going to be discussing wrongful convictions. I'm going to frame this discussion around the government report that I assigned for you to read. As you can see, I have it up here on the screen. And the report is called Predicting Erroneous Convictions, a Social Science Approach to Miscarriages of Justice. It was written by Gould, Carreno, Leo, and Young, and it looks like it was released in 2013. Now, obviously, this is a pretty lengthy report at approximately 434 pages. So we'll approach it by focusing on the executive summary. The executive summary literally just provides a breakdown of the major findings of the report. Obviously, I encourage you to read the entire report if you're interested, but just for the purposes of class and just the simplicity of this discussion, we'll just focus on the executive summary and some of the major findings. And I've highlighted a lot of the major findings with respect to wrongful convictions in this presentation. So we'll just walk through and discuss some of the major findings of this report and how they relate to this concept of wrongful conviction. So first off, what is a wrongful conviction? According to Gould and colleagues, a wrongful conviction is a situation where a factually innocent individual is convicted of a criminal offense that they did not commit. So in other words, we have a situation where someone is convicted of a crime that they are innocent of. They did not do it, but they've been convicted of the crime. Obviously, this is a very serious and scary problem in our criminal justice system. And it's just alarming and uncomfortable to think about the possibility that somebody might be serving time in prison for a crime that they didn't commit, or somebody might be on death row for a crime they didn't commit, or someone might have even been executed for a crime that they didn't commit. Obviously, it's a very horrible position for anyone to be in. And the authors of the report, Gould and colleagues, suggest that the public has become more aware of wrongful convictions over the last 20 or 30 years or so because of advances in DNA testing and DNA technology. And I think this is correct, in that seemingly, all the time we're hearing stories about people who served really lengthy prison sentences and then were released and exonerated as a result of new DNA tests which showed that they were innocent, that they did not commit the crime that they were convicted of and sentenced for. And so obviously this is a pretty serious reoccurring problem that we hear quite a bit about. So to understand the problem of wrongful conviction, Gould and colleagues also talk about this concept of a near miss. So what exactly do they mean by a near miss? A near miss, according to Gould and Associates, is when the CJ system correctly acquits or dismisses charges against a factually innocent defendant before they are convicted, thus a near miss. So in other words, what this means is that someone who is factually innocent of a crime is arrested, they're charged, but they're kicked out of the system before they go on to the next stage. And the next stage would be conviction. So the difference between a near miss and a wrongful conviction is that with a wrongful conviction, we have an innocent person that's convicted of the crime. A near miss, we have an innocent person that is charged, but the system basically works and kicks them out before they become a wrongful conviction or before they're wrongfully convicted. And understanding these two terms is the key to understanding the Gould et al. Study, because they use these terms quite a bit and they hinge their discussion and their findings on differentiating between wrongful convictions and near misses. So, make sure that you understand what these terms mean. So again, wrongful conviction, a factually innocent person is convicted of a crime. a near miss, a factually innocent person is charged with a crime, but they're acquitted before they even go on to the conviction stage. So in setting up their study, Gould and colleagues do a pretty exhaustive review of the literature, and they look specifically at what other scholars and researchers have said about wrongful conviction generally, and they draw quite a bit from this 1932 study by Edward Borchardt and his book Convicting the Innocent, which highlighted 65 cases of people that were erroneously or wrongfully convicted. And they highlight these reasons for wrongful conviction. So one of the key reasons is mistaken eyewitness identification. And so this is a situation where you have an eyewitness to the crime, but they identify the wrong person. And Gould and colleagues talk about this occurring quite a bit in stranger rape cases. So if you have a situation where, let's say, a woman is attacked and raped by a stranger, and then later on she identifies the wrong person as being her attacker, maybe in a police lineup and eventually in court. But this mistaken eyewitness identification is a key problem leading to wrongful conviction. Another problem is false confessions. So this is pretty straightforward. This is just when you have somebody that, for whatever reason, confesses to a crime that they did not commit. Another problem is tunnel vision. Tunnel vision occurs when criminal justice actors, so whether it's the police or the prosecution or both, really believe that a particular person is guilty of an offense, and so they load the dice against this person. They find evidence that will convict this person while at the same time ignoring or downplaying evidence that might suggest that the defendant is innocent. And so they don't explore other options or other possibilities in terms of other suspects that might have committed the crime. Rather, they just zero in on this one particular suspect and exclude all else. Some other factors that lead to wrongful conviction, according to the literature review by Gould and colleagues: perjured informant testimony or snitch testimony. So this is when you have somebody that basically lies to the police or the prosecution and provides false information. And a lot of times these informants are they're snitches, they're jailhouse informants. It's somebody that's in the system already or maybe is facing charges, and they're trying to further their own ends. They're trying to gain some concession, and so they start telling lies about other people, hoping that it will help them. But ultimately, these lies can end up convicting an innocent person. Forensic error. So according to Gould and colleagues, this involves both errors in testing, including the use of unvalidated techniques, and testimony provided by lab technicians. So we can have evidence being examined using scientific techniques that maybe are later shown to be not credible or not reliable, and also false testimony being given by lab technicians. Prosecutorial error is another factor that leads to wrongful convictions, according to the literature review, and this includes Brady violations. And basically what this boils down to is that the prosecution, let's say that the prosecution discovers evidence that the defendant is innocent. By law, they have to share this evidence with the defense, and it's referred to as exculpatory evidence. But if they don't disclose this evidence to the defense, it's a Brady violation. It's against the law. It's illegal. The case can be thrown out. But sometimes we see prosecutors making errors like this, and especially inexperienced or younger prosecutors. They may not realize that they do have to share exculpatory evidence with the defense. And then finally, this problem of inadequate defense representation. And basically, this is just bad lawyering. This means you had a bad defense attorney, they didn't do a good job representing the defendant or raising reasonable doubt. And so these are some of the reasons that Gould and colleagues found in their review of the literature that may lead to wrongful convictions. And this set the stage for the study that they did. And basically, their study was they were interested in finding, first off, if there were any additional factors that predicted erroneous or wrongful convictions. And also, they wanted to clarify whether these factors that had been identified in prior literature actually played a role in wrongful conviction. And they argue that the best way to really understand the problem is to compare erroneous convictions or wrongful convictions with near misses. And so they say that a lot of scholars that have researched this problem in the past, they just look at wrongful convictions. However, this is kind of a bit misguided because what Gould and colleagues are saying is that if you really want to understand the problem, you have to look at wrongful convictions and near misses and try to derive an understanding of what constitutes a conviction versus a near miss. Because both situations start out the same in that we have a factually innocent defendant being arrested and charged with a crime that they didn't commit. The difference is that with a near miss, the person is basically exonerated and kicked out of the system, but with a wrongful conviction, they go on to be convicted. And so, if we really want to understand this problem, we need to understand what differentiates a near miss from a wrongful conviction. And that's the lens that they use to examine this problem in their study. So basically, that leads into the questions that the study posed, trying to explain the factors in which someone is erroneously convicted in certain cases, but acquitted or have charges dismissed in other cases, so the near miss. And then also, once we figure that out, what policy interventions can we come up with to help the criminal justice system get it right, to do their job, and to acquit the innocent before they go on to that next stage of being wrongfully convicted. So in order to execute the study, they did a very interesting mixed method approach in which they combined a qualitative and quantitative data and data analysis. And they selected 460 cases that were adjudicated between the years 1980 and 2012. And they took these 460 cases and they categorized them. They put them into one of two categories. Either the case resulted in an erroneous conviction or the case resulted in a near miss. And there were, out of the 460, 260 incidents of erroneous convictions and 200 incidents of a near miss. Now, they had a difficult time coming up with a criteria for establishing factual innocence. The problem here is that anybody, or most anybody that's accused of a crime or convicted of a crime, what do they say? I didn't do it. I'm innocent. So they needed to come up with some kind of criteria for establishing whether or not the defendant was actually innocent and was factually innocent, right? And so the cases that they selected, either they hit both of these criterion or they had one of these criterion. And the criteria was judicial, executive, or legislative acknowledgement that the person did not commit the crime. So, in other words, the court or the government admitted that the person was innocent and that they didn't commit the crime. They weren't guilty. The other criterion was evidence that would convince a reasonable person that the person was innocent, such as post-conviction DNA testing or someone else being prosecuted for the crime. So basically, if there was some other evidence that would convince most people that the person was innocent. So, as they cite here, DNA testing, someone else being charged with the crime, and so on. So the quantitative part of the study utilized content analysis to understand factors that were important to each of the cases. And then they did a statistical analysis using logistic regression to assess which factors predicted an erroneous conviction versus a near miss. If you're at all familiar with logistic regression, it is concerned with binary outcomes. So basically, you have a binary independent or dependent variable, sorry, which is either 0 or 1. Okay. And so they use logistic regression to see which factors predicted either a near miss or a erroneous conviction, a wrongful conviction. And then the qualitative part of the study involved focus group discussions with various CJ practitioners. It looks like they pulled in prosecutors, judges, defense attorneys, police officers, forensic scientists, and researchers. And basically, you just get these folks together and just ask them what factors do they think lead to wrongful convictions or near misses. And so now we'll move on to the major findings of Gould and colleagues' study. And these are the predictors that emerged as important in both the quantitative and qualitative portions of the study. So the first factor they said that leads to wrongful conviction is state punitiveness. So the more punitive the state is, the higher the chance of erroneous conviction. And they speculated about some reasons for this, and they just said that in a more punitive state, that police and prosecutors might be more interested in just getting a conviction no matter what. And so that could factor into it. Another possibility here is that there might be community pressure to resolve a case very quickly. And so there's a need for swift resolutions to cases, especially serious crimes like rape and murder. And so basically, if you have a really punitive state, that can lead to a wrongful conviction. The second factor that they identified that leads to wrongful conviction is the strength of the prosecution's case. And they suggest here that the weaker the case, the more likely there might be a wrongful conviction based on some of these other factors, such as Brady violations or lying non-witness evidence. So this gets back to some of the earlier factors that were identified in the literature. So Brady violations, essentially cases where the prosecution has evidence that the defendant is innocent, but they don't share this information with the defense. And then lying non-witness evidence, or the jailhouse snitch. So in other words, the prosecution relies on an informant to provide information, but that informant is probably lying. The third factor that they identify is forensic error. And again, this was identified in earlier literature, but here they said it has more to do with the presentation. So presentation in court, overstating the certainty of certain tests, misinterpreting statistics, okay, neglecting to provide key information to the jury about factors such as the victim blood type or the perpetrator blood type. So basically just problems with the forensic evidence and how it's presented to the jury. That if there's error here, that it can lead to wrongful conviction. Some other factors that they identified were age and prior history of the defendant. So they argue that younger defendants are more likely to be wrongfully convicted. And also, defendants that have had a prior criminal record are also more likely to be wrongfully convicted. Another factor that they point to is intentional misidentification by eyewitnesses. So again, we see a repeat of an earlier theme here, but what's really interesting is they kind of break this down and they say that this is a more complex problem, and that you can have honest misidentification versus a dishonest or basically lying identification. And what this means here is that we can have situations where an eyewitness identifies the defendant, and it could be because they're honestly mistaken, or it could be because they're lying and they're trying to implicate the defendant in the crime. So, we might think about, informant testimony here. And they say that the problem is more difficult to understand and disentangle if we have an honest mistake. Okay. So, in other words, let's just say that someone robs a gas station, and the gas station attendant points out Joe Blow and says, I think that this is the man that robbed me. Well, let's say the gas station attendant is wrong, but he believes that he's right. This is a lot more likely to lead to a wrongful conviction, according to their study, because you have a situation where the witness is just, they're wrong. They don't realize it. They don't acknowledge it. They just are making an honest mistake. On the other hand, if you have someone that lies, it's easier to break down that testimony. It's easier to identify false testimony, because you can untangle a lie better than you can untangle a situation where someone's telling the truth, but what they think to be the truth, and they're just confused. So then they also talk about the strength of the defense. Interestingly, they say that the type of attorney here didn't matter. So in their analysis, they looked at whether or not the defendant was represented by the public defender or private counsel. And they said really that the type of attorney didn't matter in predicting a wrongful conviction, but rather the amount of work that the attorney put into the case is what mattered. So the amount of time that they spent investigating the case predicted whether or not it would be a wrongful conviction. So less time spent, more likely that the defendant would be wrongfully convicted. And finally, they identify tunnel vision as a key problem, but they said rather than just pointing at the police or the prosecution, that it is just a systemic problem within the criminal justice system itself, and that we can look at either the police or the prosecution or a combination of both. And tunnel vision can lead to a wrongful conviction. So anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for the discussion of the Gould study. If you have any questions about this, I encourage you to send me an email or leave me a comment here on YouTube, and I would be happy to address them.